The candle in Marianne Colworth's room had burned down to a stub the night her father told her she was to be married to a man she had never met. And even now, 3 weeks later, she could still feel the exact chill that had moved through her when he said the name. Not because the name was cruel, not because the man was known to be unkind, but because it was, in that moment, only a name, a signature at the bottom of a letter, a title attached to an estate 2 counties away, a stranger who would own the rest of her life before she had ever seen his face. She was 22, the elder of 2 daughters in a household that had learned, over the last several years, the particular exhaustion of trying to appear unbothered by poverty. Her father, Mr. Edmund Colworth, had been a gentleman of modest but respectable means until a series of bad harvests and a worse investment had reduced the family to a genteel sort of scraping. Her mother had died when Marianne was 16, leaving her to raise her younger sister, Harriet, largely on her own, a fact that had given Marianne a quiet steadiness that people mistook, more often than not, for coldness. Harriet was the pretty one. Everyone said so, and no one meant it unkindly, though it landed unkindly all the same. Harriet had their mother's fair curls and easy laugh, while Marianne had inherited their father's solemn dark eyes and a habit of watching a room before she spoke in it. At assemblies, gentlemen's gazes moved to Harriet the way water finds the lowest point in a field, without effort, without thought. Marianne had grown so accustomed to being looked past that she had stopped expecting otherwise, and had built instead a private dignity that did not depend on being seen. It was this dignity her father had, without quite meaning to, put a price on. "The Earl of Ashcombe wrote to your uncle some years ago," her father had said that evening, turning the letter over in his hands as though it might feel less final if he did not look directly at it. "Before we lost the money, before everything, it was an understanding, more than an arrangement. But he has renewed the correspondence. He wishes to marry Marianne, and he has asked most particularly after you." "After me," she had repeated, "or after whatever remains of Papa's good name to attach himself to." Her father had winced, because it was not an unfair question, and because he loved her too much to pretend it was. "I do not know the man," he admitted. "I have not seen him since he was a boy of 16, visiting his uncle's estate the summer your mother and I were courting. I remember only that he was quiet, and that he watched everything and said very little of it aloud." It was not much to build a marriage on, but it was, Marianne understood without being told, the only thing standing between her family and the slow, grinding embarrassment of ruin. Harriet's dowry, what little existed of it, depended on this match being made. The roof over their heads, leased now, not owned, depended on it. And so Marianne had said yes, because there had never truly been a version of the evening in which she said anything else, and she had gone up to her room afterward and let herself cry exactly once, quietly, into a pillow that would tell no one, before she washed her face and came down the next morning composed. She did not know what the Earl of Ashcombe looked like. She did not know his voice, his temper, his kindness or lack of it. She knew only that in 6 weeks' time, at the harvest assembly in the neighboring town of Wexbourne, the families were finally to be introduced in person before the contracts were signed. A formality, her father called it, though Marianne suspected it was also a mercy, a chance for either party to withdraw before the thing became irreversible. She did not intend to give the Earl any reason to withdraw. She intended, in fact, to be perfectly unremarkable, pleasant, composed, invisible in the particular way she had trained herself to be invisible, so that whatever decision he made it for the family's sake, and not because she had disappointed him in some personal, humiliating way. It did not occur to her to hope he might want her for herself. Hope of that kind had never served her well, and she had long since stopped extending it credit. What she did not know, what no one in Wexbourne knew, save for a single manservant sworn to silence, was that the Earl of Ashcombe had already arrived in the district, quietly, under no name that would mean anything to anyone. 10 days before the assembly, a gentleman calling himself Mr. Julian Ash had taken rooms at the coaching inn on the edge of the village, claiming business with a local land agent, and had begun, in the unhurried way of a man with nowhere he needed to be, making the acquaintance of the neighborhood. He told himself it was prudence. A man did not commit his whole life, his title, his estate, and whatever remained of his capacity for happiness, to a woman he had seen only in his uncle's decade-old description of a solemn, dark-eyed girl who used to read to her mother in the garden. He wanted, before the contracts made the thing unbreakable, to see her as she truly was, not as she would present herself once she knew who he was and what depended on her performance, but as she was when she believed herself unwatched. It was, he knew, not entirely honorable. But he had watched his own father marry a woman for her fortune and connections, and had watched, over 20 years, exactly what that arrangement did to two people forced into daily proximity without ever having chosen each other honestly. He would not do that, not even for the sake of an old understanding between families. If he was to marry Miss Colworth, he wanted, at the very least, to know first whether there was anything in her worth choosing. So he watched. Quietly, at church on Sunday, where he noted that she sang without performing it, her voice pitched low enough not to draw attention, and that she was the one who steadied the elderly widow Prescott down the steps afterward, while Harriet Colworth laughed prettily with a cluster of admirers. He watched at the market, where he saw her give up her place in line to a woman with a squalling infant without any visible expectation of thanks. He watched, from a discreet distance, on an afternoon when her sister's hem tore badly at the assembly room's rehearsal for the coming ball, and Marianne, without a word of complaint, gave over her own good gown to be altered for Harriet, since there was no money for 2 new gowns, and Harriet's was beyond simple repair, leaving herself to make do with whatever could be salvaged from an older one, mended and let out, and hoping it would pass in candlelight. He did not yet know her name was attached to his future. He only knew that she was the most interesting person he had encountered in a very long time, and that she seemed entirely unaware of it. They met properly, or as properly as an unintroduced gentleman and lady could meet, on a grey afternoon, a week before the assembly, on the lane that ran along the mill pond outside the village. Marianne had gone walking to escape the house, where Harriet was in a fit of nerves over ribbon colours, and their Aunt Prudence was fanning the fire of that anxiety with unhelpful opinions, and Marianne had needed, badly, an hour in which no one required anything of her. She did not see the man until she had nearly walked into him, both of them rounding the bend of the hedge at the same moment, and she startled back with a small, undignified gasp that made her flush with embarrassment even before she had properly looked at him. "Forgive me," he said, and there was something in the low, even register of his voice that struck her instantly as unusual. Not the practiced smoothness of a man accustomed to charming, but something more careful, more attentive. "I ought to have made more noise. I forget the lane is narrow here. It is I who should apologize," Marianne said, recovering herself. "I was not attending. I rarely am, on this lane. It is the one place I permit myself not to attend to anything." She had not meant to say something so unguarded to a stranger, and she saw, with a small jolt, that he had noticed the honesty of it, that his eyes, a clear grey-green, had sharpened with a kind of interest that felt entirely different from the polite, glancing interest she was used to receiving. "That seems a wise use of a lane," he said. "Most people spend their solitude rehearsing conversations they'll never have. I'd rather not attend to anything either, when I can manage it." "You are not from Wexbourne," she said. It was not quite a question. "No, Mr. Ash," he said, with a small bow. "I am here a few weeks on business. And you are—" "Miss Colworth," she said, and thought nothing of the way his expression held very still for the length of one breath, before easing again into simple courtesy. She did not know, could not have known, that he had just heard, for the first time, the voice belonging to the name written in his uncle's letter, and that it was nothing like what he had expected, and everything like what he had hoped. "Miss Colworth," he repeated, as though testing the shape of it. Then I am fortunate in my choice of lane. They spoke for perhaps 20 minutes, of nothing consequential, the coming assembly, the unusual mildness of the autumn, a heron he claimed to have seen fishing at the mill pond that she suspected he had invented to keep the conversation alive. She found, to her surprise, that she did not want the conversation to end. There was an ease in his attention that she had not experienced with any gentleman before. He did not look past her towards some more decorative point of interest, nor did he look at her the assessing way men sometimes looked at women they considered marriageable. He simply listened, and asked another question, and listened again. When they parted, he did not ask to call on her, and she told herself this was for the best. A gentleman with unclear intentions and no introduction from a mutual acquaintance was not a gentleman a sensible woman encouraged, particularly not a woman 6 weeks from her own arranged marriage to someone else entirely. She walked home telling herself, quite firmly, that the warmth she felt was only the pleasure of an interesting conversation and nothing more, and she was almost convinced by the time she reached her own gate. She did not think of him twice that night. She told herself she would not think of him at all. She was wrong on both counts, though she would not have admitted it under any persuasion. She lay awake later than she should have, listening to Harriet's easy breathing in the next room, turning the conversation over as though it were a coin she might read some hidden inscription on if she examined it from enough angles. It was absurd, she told herself. A man passing through on business, a lane, 20 minutes of talk about a heron that likely did not exist. It was nothing on which to build even the smallest hope. And hope, she had learned through long practice, was a luxury she generally could not afford. And yet she found herself, 3 separate times over the following 2 days, choosing that same lane for her walk, telling herself each time that it was simply the pleasantest route, that the mill pond caught the afternoon light in a way no other path in Wexbourne quite managed, and never once admitting the truer reason until the 2nd week had already slipped by and the pattern had become impossible to deny even to herself. Julian, for his part, spent those same days in a state he did not entirely recognize in himself. He had come to Wexbourne prepared to be disappointed, or at best mildly satisfied, a reasonable young woman, tolerable in temperament, whom he might, over years, learn a comfortable fondness for. He had not prepared himself for the particular unsteadiness of watching a woman give away her own dinner roll to a hungry child outside the bakery without a flicker of self-congratulation, or for the strange, unfamiliar tightness in his chest when she laughed, really laughed, unguarded, at something he had said that he had not even intended as clever. He wrote to his steward that week to say his business in the district would require a further fortnight, and told himself this was prudence, and knew, even as he sealed the letter, that it was something considerably less reasonable than that. They met again 3 days later, an accident so precisely engineered by Julian that it did not look engineered at all, at the lending library in the village, where Marianne had gone to return a volume of sermons her aunt favoured, and to quietly, guiltily, borrow something she actually wanted to read. She found him already there, examining a shelf with the polite blankness of a man who does not much care what he finds, and when their eyes met, something in his face changed in a way that she could not name, but that made her pulse behave strangely. "Miss Colworth," he said, "you are haunting the same 3 streets I am. I begin to suspect Providence." "I begin to suspect coincidence is a more modest word for it," she said, "but I will allow you the grander one, if it pleases you." He laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of him, and she felt an unreasonable flush of pride at having produced it. They fell, over the following 2 weeks, into a pattern that was never quite arranged and never quite accidental. A walk here, an encounter at the milliner's there, once a long conversation in the church porch, while rain kept them both from leaving. Marianne told herself each time that this would be the last, that she owed it to her coming marriage to stop seeking out, or allowing herself to be sought out by, a man who was not the one she was contracted to. And each time she found some reason the conversation had simply happened, unplanned, unavoidable, and each time she found herself telling him things she had not told anyone, her fear for Harriet's future, the particular loneliness of managing a household that used to be managed by her mother, the private shame of watching her father grow smaller under the weight of debts he had not entirely earned. She never told him about the Earl of Ashcombe. It felt, obscurely, like betraying two men at once to speak of one to the other, as though naming her intended to this stranger would make real a future she was, without quite admitting it to herself, dreading more with every day that brought her closer to Mr. Ashe, and further from the marriage waiting at the end of it. There was an afternoon, near the end of the first week, when Harriet's careless chatter nearly forced the subject into the open. They had gone together to visit the dressmaker over the matter of the ball gowns, and Harriet, delighted by some private joke of her own, had mentioned within Mr. Ashe's hearing, for he had happened to be at the same shop, examining a set of gloves with the studied patience of a man waiting for an excuse to linger, that her sister was soon to be a countess, if all went as their father hoped. Marianne had gone very still, certain the whole fragile arrangement of these unspoken weeks was about to collapse, but Mr. Ashe had only inclined his head politely and said that he wished the family every happiness in it, his face giving away nothing of what he already knew, and she did not. She had spent the walk home rehearsing explanations she never needed to give, and had told herself, with some relief, that the danger had passed, not understanding that the true danger lay not in discovery, but in the silence both of them had, for their own private reasons, chosen to preserve a little longer. It was in that same week that the small gestures began, nothing so bold as a gift, for he understood instinctively that a woman guarding her dignity as carefully as she did would refuse anything that smelled of charity, but smaller things. He remembered, from an offhand remark she made about her mother, that she had once loved pressed violets, and left, without explanation, a small paper packet of them tucked into the hymnal she used at church, so that she found it only when she opened the book the following Sunday, and had to compose herself before the service began. He arranged, through a quiet word to the innkeeper, that the good chair by the fire in the public room, the one Marianne's father favoured on the rare evenings he permitted himself an hour away from his ledgers, was always kept free before Mr. Colworth arrived, a small kindness her father mentioned to her, with pleased bewilderment, never guessing its true author. None of it was declared, all of it was noticed, by a woman who had spent years being the one who noticed others and had nearly forgotten what it felt like to be noticed in return. Julian, for his part, said nothing of who he truly was. He told himself, at first, that this was merely the caution he had begun with, that he was still testing, still watching, still making certain. But somewhere in the second week, watching her laugh over some small absurdity, with her guard entirely down, he understood that the caution had become something closer to cowardice. He was no longer testing her. He had already decided. What he feared now was that the moment she learned his name, the ease between them, the particular unguarded honesty she gave only to a man she believed had nothing to gain from her, would vanish, replaced by the careful performance she gave everyone else. He admitted to himself late one night at the inn, afraid of losing the one version of her that had chosen to be near him for no reason, but that she wanted to be. It could not last, of course. Nothing built on an unspoken name ever does. The turn came 10 days before the assembly, on an afternoon that began ordinarily enough. Marianne had gone to the milliner's with Harriet to collect the newly retrimmed bonnet meant to accompany the altered gown, and it was there, waiting outside while Harriet fussed over ribbon, that she overheard two matrons of the neighborhood speaking behind a display of silk flowers, entirely unaware of who stood near enough to hear them. "And they say Ashcombe himself is already in the district," one was saying, low and delighted with the scandal of it. "Come in secret, if you can credit it, under some false name, to look the Colworth girl over before he commits himself, as if he were buying a horse." "Well, and can you blame him?" the other returned. "Given the family's circumstances, I should think any sensible man would want to know what he was getting before he signed anything, though I hear he's been quite taken with someone in the village these past weeks, a Miss Nobody, they say, met on the lane. One wonders what Miss Colworth will make of that." once she learns her intended has been courting another woman under her very nose while pretending to consider her. Marianne went very still. She did not, in the moment, connect the two threads, the secret earl and the man on the lane, into the single truth that would have been obvious to anyone standing further from her own heart. What she heard, what landed and lodged like a stone in her chest, was only this: that the Earl of Ashcombe, the man to whom her whole family's future was pledged, was already in Wexbourne, already known to be forming an attachment to some other, luckier woman, even as he prepared to marry her out of obligation. She felt something in her that she recognized, distantly, as the particular grief of being chosen not for herself, but as the least troublesome option, and beneath it, a colder fear for Harriet, for her father, for the roof over their heads, if the Earl's private inclinations should lead him to withdraw from the match after all. She did not think, even once, of Mr. Ashe. It did not occur to her that a false name given by a secretive Earl and a false name given by the gentleman she had walked with on the Mill Pond Lane might be the same false name. Grief has its own logic, and hers in that moment ran entirely toward the marriage she had never wanted and now stood to lose in the most humiliating manner possible, replaced, before the contracts were even signed, by a woman she would never meet. She said nothing to Harriet. She said nothing to her father. Not yet, though the knowledge sat in her like a low fever for the rest of that day and the next. It was 3 days later that she next encountered Julian, by the mill pond again, as though the place itself had claimed them, and she found she could not meet him with her usual ease. She was withdrawn, careful, her answers shorter than he had grown used to, and he, sensing the change without understanding its cause, grew quiet in turn, watching her with the particular attentiveness that had first drawn her to him and now felt, to her raw nerves, almost unbearable. "You are troubled," he said finally, when the silence had gone on too long to pretend otherwise. "I am to be married," she said, before she had quite decided to say it. It came out of her like something long held under water, surfacing all at once. "In a matter of weeks. To a man I have never met, who is, I am told, already in this district, already forming attachments elsewhere, and who will marry me regardless, because my family requires it, and his does not much care who fills the role, so long as someone does." She had not meant to say so much. She saw the shock move through his face, not, as she read it, shock at learning she was promised to another, but something closer to the particular stillness of a man watching a misunderstanding assemble itself brick by brick in front of him, unable yet to say the single sentence that would knock the whole structure down. "Marianne," he said, the first time he had used her given name, and it landed on her with such unexpected tenderness that she almost forgave him everything before she knew there was anything to forgive. "What is the name of the man you are promised to?" "The Earl of Ashcombe," she said. "Not that it signifies. I do not imagine you are acquainted with him." He was silent for a long moment, and in that silence, watching his face, she felt the first genuine cold suspicion move through her. Not yet the full shape of the truth, but its shadow, long before the sun that cast it. "I know him," Julian said carefully. "Rather better than you would think." She waited. He did not finish the sentence. And because he did not finish it, because in that instant his courage failed him, wanting one more day, one more conversation, before he handed her the truth that might end everything between them, she took his silence for confirmation of the worst version of events, that he knew the Earl, knew of his straying attentions in the village, and had, perhaps, known all along precisely who she was, and had simply not thought her worth the honesty of saying so. "I see," she said, very quietly, and there was a wound in her voice that he had never heard there before. "Then you will forgive me if I do not stay longer. I find I am rather tired of gentlemen who know a great deal more than they say." She left him standing on the lane, and he let her go, because he did not yet have the words ready, and because some coward's instinct in him whispered that one more day of preparation could not possibly cost him very much. It cost him a great deal more than he expected. The 5 days that followed were the worst Marianne had known since her mother's death. She went about her duties with the same outward composure she had maintained through every hardship of the last several years. But something in her had gone quiet in a different way now. Not the deliberate quiet of a woman guarding her dignity, but the flatter quiet of a woman who has stopped expecting to be surprised by anything good. Harriet noticed, in her own scattered way, and asked twice if Marianne was unwell, and was told, both times, that she was only tired. She had, in those 5 days, begun to understand something about herself that she had not previously examined too closely. That whatever she had told herself about the ease of her friendship with Mr. Ashe, it had not been mere ease. She had fallen, not carefully, not sensibly, but entirely, for a man about whom she knew almost nothing, at the precise moment she was contracted to marry a man about whom she knew even less. And now the two men had, in her understanding, folded into a single betrayal, an earl who did not think her worth meeting honestly, and a stranger who had known the truth and kept it from her regardless. She resolved to put both from her mind and attend to the one duty that remained unambiguous, the assembly at Wexbourne, 3 days hence, where she would meet the Earl of Ashcombe as arranged, and conduct herself, whatever her private grief, with the composure her family's future required. It was during those same 5 days that her Aunt Prudence, sensing some change in her niece's spirits, but mistaking its cause entirely, took it upon herself to remind Marianne, at length and with great satisfaction, precisely how fortunate the family was in this match, and how little Marianne's own preferences ought to signify beside so considerable a fortune. "A woman in your position," her aunt said, not unkindly but without any particular gentleness either, "cannot afford the luxury of a broken heart over some passing acquaintance. Whatever you imagine you have lost these past weeks, my dear, was never truly yours to keep. Your duty was always going to end at Ashcombe's door, and I should think you would be grateful it ends there in comfort rather than penury." Marianne had said nothing in reply, because there was nothing to say that her aunt would have understood, and had gone up to her room afterward with the particular ache of a woman being told, gently and with perfect confidence, that her own heart was an indulgence she had no right to. It was harder in some ways than the discovery itself had been, not the grief of losing what she believed she had lost, but the quiet insistence from every corner of her small world that she had no standing to grieve it at all. She thought, more than once in those 5 days, of simply writing to Mr. Ashe, wherever he had gone, whatever business had called him away, for he did not call again after the scene by the mill pond, to demand the truth plainly, rather than living inside her own worst assumptions. But pride, and the particular exhaustion of a woman who has spent years managing everyone else's feelings before her own, kept her from it, and she told herself, each night, that she would be composed by morning, and each morning discovered that composure was a harder thing to manufacture than she had once believed. Julian, meanwhile, was engaged in the least comfortable 3 days of his adult life. He had gone back to the inn that evening and sat for a long time with his uncle's old letter in front of him, the one that had started the whole correspondence years before, and had understood, reading it again, precisely how badly he had managed the thing he had told himself he was managing so carefully. He had wanted to know her honestly before the contracts made everything irreversible. He had succeeded, too well in fact, for now he knew not only her honesty, but the particular ache in her voice when she believed herself passed over, and he understood that his silence, meant as patience, had instead confirmed the very fear he most needed to dispel. There was no elegant way to correct it now. There was only the truth, delivered as plainly and as soon as he could arrange it, and the hope that she might yet believe him. He wrote to her father that same night, requesting, with as much formality as the strange circumstances allowed, that the introduction planned for the assembly be moved forward, that he might call at the Colworth home the following afternoon, before the public event made everything a matter of performance rather than honesty. Mr. Colworth, startled but not ungrateful for the Earl's evident eagerness, agreed. Marianne did not know, when she was told that the Earl of Ashcombe would call the next day rather than wait for the assembly, that the caller and the man from the Mill Pond Lane were the same. She spent the morning in a state of dull dread, dressing with more care than she felt, rehearsing the composed, pleasant unremarkableness she had promised herself she would offer him, determined that whatever grief lived in her over Mr. Ashe would not be visible to a man she was bound, regardless, to marry. She was in the small parlor, arranging herself by the window in the particular posture of a woman determined to look calm, when the door opened and her father came in, followed by a gentleman whose face stopped every rehearsed word in her throat at once. It was him, the grey-green eyes, the careful, attentive stillness. Mr. Ashe, standing in her own parlor, dressed now with an unmistakable elegance she had not seen on the Mill Pond Lane, being introduced by her father, in a voice thick with relief and pride, as the Earl of Ashcombe, my dear, Lord Julian. For one long moment, Marianne could not make her mind hold both truths at once, the stranger she had loved and grieved, and the Earl she had feared and resented, refusing stubbornly to resolve into the single man standing before her. Then they resolved all at once, with a force that made her sit down rather suddenly on the window seat, and she understood, in a single unbearable rush, that the man who had known everyone she cared about, who had let her speak of her family's ruin and her private loneliness with no obligation to be honest in return, who had let her believe he was courting some other woman while all along it had only ever been her, that man had been him the entire time. "You?" she said, and it was not a greeting. "Marianne." Her father's brows rose sharply at the familiarity, but Julian did not look away from her. "I should have told you on the lane. I should have told you the very first day. I have no defense for the silence, except that I was a coward, and that I wanted, selfishly, unforgivably, one more day of being known by you as myself, before I became only my title in your eyes." "You let me believe," she said, her voice shaking now with an anger that had nowhere else to go, "that the Earl of Ashcombe was courting some other woman in this village while preparing to marry me from obligation. You let me grieve you as two separate injuries when you were only ever the one man doing both." "I did not know you had heard that," Julian said, and for the first time something like real alarm crossed his face. "Marianne, there was no other woman. There has never been anyone else. Whatever gossip reached you, it mistook the truth for its opposite. I did not court someone else while considering you. I came to this village entirely and only for you, before I had even the courage to say so, and every hour I spent on that lane, at the library, in the church porch, I spent because I could not stay away from the one woman in this district who seemed to have no notion of her own worth, and who I had already, in my own mind, chosen." Mr. Colworth, sensing correctly that he had wandered into a conversation requiring privacy he was not equipped to provide, murmured something about seeing to the tea and withdrew with more haste than dignity. Marianne sat very still, the anger in her chest beginning, despite every attempt to hold it, to crumble at the edges. "You let me believe you knew the Earl," she said, quieter now, "and said nothing, when you might have ended my grief with a single sentence." "I know," he said. "I have no excuse that does not sound like weakness, because it was weakness. I was afraid that the moment you knew who I was, you would become careful, guarded, the way I imagine you are with every man whose good opinion your family's future depends on. I did not want that woman. I wanted the one who walked into me on the lane and told me, without thinking, that it was the one place she allowed herself not to attend to anything. I have not stopped thinking of her since." "That woman," Marianne said, "is still afraid you chose her only because your father's letter obliged you to look at her at all." "Then let me be entirely plain, since I have clearly failed to be so until now," Julian said, and crossed the room to stand before her, close enough that she had to look up to hold his eyes. "I did not need my father's letter, or your father's, or any contract at all, to choose you. I came to this village suspicious of the whole arrangement, prepared to find some pleasant, unremarkable young woman I could marry, out of duty, and manage, over time, to be fond of. I did not expect to find a woman who gives up her place in a market line without a thought of thanks, who mends her own gown so her sister might have the new one, who sings in church as though she has forgotten anyone else is listening. I did not fall in love with the Earl's intended bride, Marianne. I fell in love with you before I ever let myself remember that the two were meant to be the same woman, and I have been terrified, every day since, that you would learn the truth and decide the man on the lane was worth less to you than you had believed, simply because he also carried a title. The silence that followed held a different quality than the one before it. Not the flat silence of grief, but the trembling, over-full silence of a woman deciding whether to believe something she wanted, desperately, to be true. "There is something else," Marianne said slowly, as the full shape of the past weeks rearranged itself in her mind. "My aunt told me, not 3 days past, that whatever I imagined I had lost was never truly mine to keep, that my heart was a luxury I had no standing to indulge, given what depended upon this marriage. I believed her, Julian, or told myself I did, because it was easier than hoping. I had begun to make peace with a marriage of duty to a stranger, and to grieve, quietly, the loss of a man who I now understand was never lost at all, only withheld from me by his own silence. Then I have wronged you twice over," he said, and there was real distress in his voice now, once in the silence itself, and once in all it cost you before I found the courage to end it. "I will not ask you to forget that cost. I ask only that you let me spend a great deal of time proving it was not, after all, a fair exchange for what I can offer you now." "You should have told me," she said at last, but there was no more anger in it, only a kind of exhausted honesty. "You cost me 5 days I will not get back, believing myself unwanted by 2 men instead of chosen, entirely, by one." "I know," he said again, "and I will spend considerably longer than 5 days making amends for it, if you will let me." She looked at him a long moment, this man who had watched her before he ever spoke to her, who had noticed the things no one else troubled to notice, who had been, all along, both the stranger she never looked at twice and the man her father had chosen for her, folded improbably into a single person she had fallen in love with twice, without ever knowing it was only once. "I think," she said slowly, "I should like some time to be angry with you before I forgive you entirely." "Take whatever time you require," Julian said, and something in his face had eased now, the particular relief of a man who understands he has not, after all, lost the thing he most feared losing. "I find I am a very patient man, when the alternative is losing you." She did not forgive him that day, though the anger had already begun its long, quiet retreat. And by the time her father returned with the tea tray, some 15 minutes later than any tea tray strictly needed to take, he found his daughter and the Earl of Ashcombe seated at a proper, respectable distance from one another, speaking in low voices about nothing he could quite make out, and wearing, both of them, the particular unguarded expressions of 2 people who have just discovered they are allowed, after all, to want the same thing. The 5 days that remained before the Wexbourne Assembly were not, as Marianne had feared, days of dread, but days of a slow, careful rebuilding. Julian calling each afternoon with a patience that never once presumed forgiveness before it was offered, Marianne allowing herself, bit by bit, to trust the version of events he had given her, until the trust was no longer an act of will, but simply the truth she lived inside. Harriet, delighted beyond measure to learn the whole story, declared it the most romantic thing she had ever heard, and could not be persuaded to stop saying so. Her Aunt Prudence, informed at last of the true state of affairs, was obliged to revise her opinions with as much dignity as she could muster, which was not a great deal. She took instead to remarking, to anyone who would listen, that she had always suspected there was something particular in the way the Earl looked at Marianne, a claim that bore no resemblance whatsoever to anything she had said or believed a week before, and that Marianne, in the new lightness of her own happiness, found she could forgive without much difficulty. Even her father, who had spent the engagement in a state of quiet, anxious hope that his daughter's future might be secured without costing her the very qualities he loved best in her, seemed to unclench, over those 5 days, in a way Marianne had not seen since before her mother's death, as though some weight he had carried, without ever naming it aloud, had finally been set down. There was one afternoon, midway through that week, when Julian arrived not for the usual formal call but on foot, unannounced, having walked the whole distance from the inn simply because he found he could not wait the additional hour a proper carriage would have required. He found Marianne in the garden, examining the roses her mother had planted years before and that she tended now with a care she gave to little else, and he stood at the gate for a moment, simply watching her before she noticed him, not from any renewed instinct towards secrecy, but because he had discovered, in the weeks of watching her before he had any right to, that the habit of quiet observation was one he did not wish to break, even now that he was permitted to simply walk to her and say what he felt. "You are doing it again," she said, without turning, for she had heard the gate after all. "I find I cannot help it," he admitted, coming to stand beside her among the roses. "You are considerably more interesting to watch than anything else in this district, and I have grown accustomed to the pleasure of it. You might simply speak to me, now that you are permitted." "I intend to do both," he said, "for as long as you will allow me the privilege of either." She had laughed then, an easy, unguarded laugh that belonged entirely to the woman he had first met on the Millpond Lane, and he understood, watching her among her mother's roses, that whatever damage the silence had done, it had not touched the thing in her he loved most, that particular capacity to give her whole self to a moment, once she trusted it was safe to do so. But there remained the assembly itself, and with it, the public performance the whole district had been anticipating for weeks, the formal introduction of the Earl of Ashcombe to his intended bride, an introduction that had, in the strangest possible way, already happened, and happened wrongly, weeks before it was meant to. Wexbourne society did not know the truth of the Millpond Lane. What it knew, or believed it knew, was only the gossip that had reached Marianne's own ears, that the Earl had come in secret, under a false name, to size up the Colworth girl like a horse at auction, and had, in the meantime, been seen forming a suspicious attachment to some unknown woman in the village. It was Lady Farring, a woman whose tongue was widely regarded as sharper than her sense, who raised the matter at the assembly itself, before Julian had been properly announced, in a voice pitched precisely to be overheard by as many guests as possible. "I understand, Miss Colworth," she said, approaching Marianne with a smile that did not reach her eyes, "that your intended has been rather occupied these past weeks with some young woman met upon a country lane. One does wonder what sort of husband arrives, already distracted, before the wedding has even been arranged. I should not think it augurs particularly well." The room, or the portion of it near enough to hear, went very quiet in the particular way a room goes quiet when it senses the possibility of a scene. Marianne felt the old, familiar instinct rise in her, the instinct to absorb the insult silently, to protect her family's fragile standing by refusing to give the gossips anything further to discuss. She had absorbed such instincts her whole life, but something had shifted in her these past days, some new steadiness that came not from having learned to expect insult, but from having learned, finally, that she was worth defending. "You are correct that Lord Ashcombe formed an attachment to a young woman upon a country lane," Marianne said, her voice clear and entirely calm, carrying further than Lady Farring had perhaps intended her own to carry. "I understand it was a rather sudden attachment, formed within days, and rather stubborn, as such things sometimes are. I understand also that the young woman in question is myself, Lady Farring, and that his lordship's crime, such as it was, consisted of preferring to know my character before he knew my dowry. I confess I cannot find it in myself to consider that a fault in him." There was a beat of astonished silence, and then, from somewhere near the punch table, a scatter of laughter. Not unkind laughter, but the laughter of a room delighted by an unexpected reversal, and Lady Farring, finding herself abruptly the subject of amusement rather than its author, retreated with considerably less grace than she had arrived. It was into this moment, Marianne still faintly flushed with the boldness of her own defense, the room still murmuring with pleased surprise, that Julian entered, having been detained by his own arrival formalities, and needed only a glance to understand that something had happened in his absence that had gone, remarkably, in his favor. "I understand I have missed a scene," he said quietly, coming to stand beside her. "You have missed nothing," Marianne said, "except my informing Lady Faring that I am the young woman you were seen forming an attachment to upon a country lane." "Did she take it well?" "She did not," Marianne said, "which I confess I did not entirely regret." He looked down at her with an expression that made her feel, for the first time in that crowded, curious room, entirely unconcerned with anyone else in it. "Miss Colworth," he said, loudly enough now for those nearby to hear, abandoning entirely the discretion the situation had previously demanded, "I wonder if I might have this dance, and every subsequent one this evening, and, should you permit it, a great many more across a great many years to come." It was not strictly a proposal, but it was near enough to one, delivered in front of half of Wexbourne society, that the room understood perfectly well what it meant, and Marianne, feeling the eyes of every gossip and well-wisher upon her, found she did not mind being seen after all. Not when the man looking at her looked as though he had already made up his mind and was only waiting, with visible patience, for her to make up hers. "You may have the dance," she said. "As for the rest, my lord, I find I require a slightly more private conversation before I commit myself to a great many years." "Then I shall arrange one," he said, "though I warn you, I intend to be thoroughly persuasive." The dance itself, when it came, drew more attention than either of them had quite anticipated, not merely from Lady Faring's circle, still recovering from its earlier humiliation, but from the whole assembly room, which had spent the better part of 2 months speculating over the mysterious gentleman on the Millpond Lane, and now watched, with undisguised fascination, as that same gentleman led Miss Colworth through the figures of the dance, with an attentiveness that made it impossible to mistake the arrangement for a merely dutiful one. Harriet, watching from the edge of the room with an expression of pure delight, declared to anyone near enough to hear that she had never in her life witnessed anything half so romantic, and several of the younger ladies present, who had previously regarded Marianne as unremarkable at best, found themselves reconsidering the matter rather thoroughly, as young ladies will, once a handsome and evidently devoted earl has made his preference plain before an entire room. Marianne, for her part, felt the eyes upon her and found, to her own quiet astonishment, that she did not mind them. She had spent so many years perfecting the art of being overlooked that the sensation of being watched approvingly, watched with something like admiration, sat strangely on her at first, like a gown cut for a woman she had not yet become. But Julian's hand was steady at her waist, and his eyes did not once stray toward any other corner of the room, and by the second turn of the dance she had stopped noticing the watchers altogether, aware only of him, and of the particular lightness in her own chest that she recognized, at last, without any further argument from her own caution, as happiness. He was. The private conversation took place 2 days later, in the garden behind the Colworth house, beneath an ash tree that Marianne had climbed as a girl and now stood beneath as a woman on the edge of the rest of her life. And Julian, who had rehearsed a great many elegant speeches in the privacy of the inn and discarded every one of them as insufficient, found that when the moment came, only the plainest words would do. "I have loved you," he said, "since before I let myself understand what love was doing to me. I loved you on the lane, when I did not yet know your name belonged to my future. I loved you at the library and the church porch, and I loved you, God help me, even in the days you would not look at me, because I understood I had earned that silence and would go on earning it for as long as it took to be forgiven. I am not offering you a title, Marianne, though you will have one. I am offering you a man who noticed you before anyone told him he ought to, and who intends to go on noticing you, carefully and completely, for the rest of both our lives, if you will permit it." "You cost me 5 very bad days," Marianne said, though her voice had gone unsteady, in a way that undid the severity of the words. "I know it," he said, I will spend the remainder of my life making certain the good days outnumber them so entirely that you forget to count. That, she said, is a rather large promise. I am a rather patient man, he said, and I have already told you so once. I intend to prove it true for as long as you will let me. She looked up at him beneath the old ash tree, at the man who had been, all along, both the stranger she had never looked at twice and the one her father had chosen for her, and understood that the two had never truly been separate, that the choosing had simply happened twice, once by her father's pen and once, more slowly and more honestly, by her own heart, and that both choices had arrived, however improbably, at the very same man. Yes, she said simply, because after everything, it was the only word left that mattered. Yes, Julian, I choose you too. They were married the following spring, in the small church at Wexbourne, with Harriet weeping happily in the front pew and Mr. Colworth looking, for the first time in years, entirely unburdened. Lady Farring attended, out of obligation more than affection, and was heard to remark, rather sourly, that she had always thought there was something quietly remarkable about Miss Colworth, a claim that fooled precisely no one who had been present at the assembly some months before. The wedding itself was a modest affair by the standards of Julian's rank, for he had insisted, against the objections of several distant relations who felt an earl's marriage ought to be a grander spectacle, that Marianne should have exactly the wedding she wanted, and no other. Small, held in the church where her mother had been married before her, attended by the people who had known her when she had nothing to recommend her but her own character. She wore, at her own quiet insistence, the same mended gown she had altered for Harriet weeks before, let out again and retrimmed for the occasion, because she wanted, she told Julian, to be married as the woman he had actually fallen in love with, and not in some borrowed finery that would have made a stranger of her on the one day she most wished to be entirely herself. He had told her, seeing her come up the aisle in it, that he had never in his life seen a gown so becoming, and had meant it entirely. Marianne came to Ashcombe as its countess, and found in the great quiet house none of the coldness she had once feared an arranged marriage might carry, because there had never truly been anything arranged about the love between them, only a stranger on a lane, who had chosen, before he knew he was allowed to, the one woman who had never thought herself worth choosing, and a woman who learned, in the choosing, that being seen and being loved could, after all, be the very same thing. She brought her father to live near enough that she might see him weekly, and settled upon Harriet, in time, a dowry generous enough that her sister's own marriage, 2 years later, to a kind and steady young clergyman, was made from genuine affection rather than necessity, a fact that gave Marianne, watching her sister's wedding from a front pew of her own, a satisfaction deeper than any she had known since her mother's death. The debts that had once hung over her father's house were quietly settled within the first year, handled with such discretion by Julian's steward that Mr. Colworth was never made to feel the charity of it, only the relief. In the years that followed, when their own daughter grew old enough to ask how her parents had met, Julian would tell it as a simple story. A lane, a mill pond, a heron, he still swore, against all evidence, that he had truly seen that first afternoon. And Marianne would only smile and let him tell it, because she had long since stopped needing anyone else to understand what she alone knew with perfect certainty, that she had been chosen twice by the same man, and that the second choosing, the one made freely, without contracts or obligation, in a garden beneath an old ash tree, was the one she would carry, gratefully, for the whole of her life. She kept, all her life, a small paper packet of pressed violets, in the same hymnal she had used the Sunday she first discovered them, long since faded to nothing more than the ghost of a colour, and she would think, whenever she came across it, of a quiet man on a country lane who had noticed her before he had any right to, and who had never once, in all the years that followed, stopped.